Newzroom Afrika's politics editor, Sbu Ngalwa, who's joining us now for an update on what else perhaps we can expect from that three-day NEC sitting. Sbu, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us here bright and early. I mean, ultimately, there were big developments coming from the ANC's NEC, with President Cyril Ramaphosa agreeing to subject himself to the party's Integrity Commission. Sbu, where will it all end?
Obviously, Lizelle, that I think is the highlight of this weekend. But I think more than anything, what this will lead to, what will lead to is that the president will appear before the commission, and the commission will make a determination whether his behavior has brought the party into disrepute, because this is an internal organ within the ANC. It's the ANC's own integrity commission, which actually was set up to guard the interests of the ANC. As you would know, that the ANC post-democracy is a party that has been mired in corruption, and its successive leaders have actually continued to embarrass the party and have the party's name dragged into disrepute. So what the president is doing here, he's actually taking away the heat from himself, because we know that his detractors within the ANC have been calling on him to resign and calling for him to account for the funds, the private funds that were raised to fund his campaign going into 2017. Not that this is illegal, but what they are raising is that it is actually unethical to have, and knowing the toxic relationship between money and politics. So what we expect is that the Integrity Commission will call the president, and the president will lay out his case, and then they'll make a determination flowing from that.
Sbu, in fact, I was reading the Sunday papers, and the city press had raised some of the questions that the president himself is seeking guidelines on within the internal rules regarding fundraising and lobbying during presidential campaigns, because there have been questions about the permissible forms, of campaigning by candidates during their presidential runs, also potential candidates openly campaigning, the manner in which that looks like. So in terms of what those guidelines and rules look like, I mean, what needs to be clearly defined going forward for the president and potential candidates as well?
Look, even for the president's detractors or political opponents within the party, Lisa, they'll actually find it difficult to find him guilty or to pin it on him, because the ANC does not have those guidelines. And they may today be standing on a podium on a self-righteous note, claiming to be representing the true ideals of the ANC. But the reality is that they know that money and politics go hand in hand. It's a toxic relationship, and the reality is that ANC campaigns and political campaigns are funded through money. But the question here is the issue of transparency. But so for as long as the ANC and actually all the other parties do not have guidelines on how they handle private donations or an influence of business, the reality is that there's little that can be done. But what needs to happen is that for any democracy, transparency and accountability sit at the center of it. And the ANC, as the governing party, should actually lead by example. We know that already there is the Political Party Funding Act that was signed by the president earlier this year, but that only deals with funds that are donated to political parties from business people, from private businesses, but it does not deal with internal elections within political parties.
And I think just adding to also what unfolded from the NEC meeting that is still taking place as the weekend concludes. I mean, we've heard growing calls by some ANC members for the president to resign. Ultimately, hearing from the likes of Tony Yengeni, as well as Andile Lungisa, amongst others. I mean, how widespread are these calls?
Lizelle, I can tell you now that those calls are not as widespread as others would like us to believe. The reality is that the president of the ANC is first elected by the membership of the ANC, and it would take actually the membership of the ANC either through a national general council or through a national conference to actually recall their president. And we also know, Lizzo, that the ANC is a selfish organization which cares about its self-preservation. Even those that are calling for the ANC president to resign, I can tell you now, they don't even have a candidate that they can push forward. It's not like there's any consensus as to who can take over from President Ramaphosa. The reality is that these are calls by a faction within the ANC, and this is the faction that was defeated at Nazareth. But what it shows you is that that faction is actually not demobilized. They are still very much intact. If you look at the pattern and the number of characters that are coming out of the woodwork challenging the president.
Just in the same breath, I mean, looking at that letter that was issued by former President Jacob Zuma, I mean, in terms of deflection tactics that have been at play, I mean, what has it done to salvage, I mean, as this was a counter-strike perhaps to the letter the President had issued last week, I mean, has it done anything to gain trust on that, on his side? I mean, what do you think it's done for the Zuma camp as well?
Look, for me, that letter actually, it was a desperate, it looks like it's a desperate attempt by Jacob Zuma and that camp. But I think more than anything, it was never intended for Cyril Ramaphosa, whom it's addressed to anyway. It was intended for general ANC membership to try and influence them one way or the other. I think this is part of the strategy by the Zuma camp to actually send a signal to the ANC membership that they are still very much part of the mix. In as much as Zuma might be sitting in Kandla and we're expecting him to be retired, he's still very much a political player. If you listen to the tone of his letter, and you see the calls that have been made by Tony Ngeni, and then tie that with what Andile Lungisa was saying, you can see that these are comrades that are reading from the same hymn sheet. So effectively, what it was intended to do was to influence ANC members. Whether it will influence ANC members or not, it remains to be seen. But also, that is a function that is also result in, it will be dependent on how President Ramaphosa plays his game going forward. We have seen that he's taken a tough stance on corruption, and also at the ANC NEC. That is exactly, we understand that is the tone he's taking. Now, we have had these calls before. We've seen the president talking tough, but it looks like this time he means business, but it remains to be seen. The jury is still out.
He's definitely taken a tough, undeterred stance. So, Sbu, I mean, as the weekend concludes, I mean, today is the last day of that NEC meeting. What can we expect going forward?
Lizzo, you will recall that this meeting comes a month after the ordinary NEC meeting, which was called last month. This was meant to deal with issues of corruption, but mostly the ANC's preparations for the local government elections. And we do understand that yesterday was spent mostly for the earlier part of the day dealing with presentations that have to do with the party's presentations for local government, including how it selects candidates, and also the impact of the successive court judgments, or in fact the constitutional court judgment on the electoral system, and to how the party is handling that. Today we expect that it will be a full day of discussions which will end with the president closing the meeting. I think there will be further debates today, and details of which we'll either hear later on or through the press conference of the ANC in the Monday, or either on Monday or Tuesday.
Sbu, as you mentioned, we'll continue to be following that story rather closely. Again, Newzroom Africa's politics editor, Sbu Ngalwa, joining us to unpack the latest at the ruling party, with President Cyril Ramaphosa vowing to stand before the Integrity Commission, as well as what we can expect on the last day of the NEC meeting.